Now, 2 months ago, the UK Labour Party suffered its worst general election result since 1987. The crushing defeat triggered a 3-month leadership contest and a fundamental debate about the party's ideological direction. Tomorrow night, the 4 candidates to succeed Ed Miliband as leader will be in Glasgow to set out their stalls at a Scottish hustings. Here's Scotland Tonight's James Chain.
This is a leadership contest taking place in the shadow of disaster. It's 2 months since Labour decisively lost a general election, which, on a UK level at least, was supposed to be a tight contest. There were some inevitable consequences.
And now it's time for someone else to take forward the leadership of this party. So I'm tendering my resignation.
And as Ed Miliband departed the stage, a period of soul-searching began, and several contenders stepped forward with a pitch to be Labour leader. Tomorrow they'll all come here, to Glasgow. Until May, there were many different ways to describe this city: a Labour stronghold, a heartland, a bastion. The general election changed all that. There are no Labour MPs left anymore. That means each of the leadership candidates will need to put forward a plan to rebuild. Former Health Secretary Andy Burnham is the frontrunner. He's portrayed himself as the only candidate who can win support in all the nations and regions of the UK.
Labour has been trapped in the Westminster bubble for far too long, and it means that we've lost our emotional connection with millions of people, not just in Scotland, but all over the country. I'm going to change that. I'm going to put Labour back in touch with ordinary people and make us the People's Party once again.
Yvette Cooper, like Burnham, was a cabinet minister under Gordon Brown. She was the first candidate to visit Scotland during the leadership campaign.
We have to recognise the profound defeat that we have had as a party across Scotland, and we have to rebuild, because we have to win back votes in central Scotland just as we have to win back votes in middle England.
Simply saying what we've said over the past 5 years.
Liz Kendall is seen as the most Blairite candidate. Of the 4, she's the least experienced, having entered Parliament in 2010. She argues the party's problems north of the border are many and complex.
I think we lost touch with voters over a long period of time there. It wasn't something that just happened at the referendum. We took voters for granted. Many of our best and brightest politicians came to Westminster. That has and is changing.
Left-winger Jeremy Corbyn struggled to get the required number of MP nominations, but got a boost from the backing of the Unite Union. He's eager to stress the ways the Scottish Party can distinguish itself.
They have been putting forward a much more radical agenda. They have opposed the renewal of the Trident nuclear missile system, which I absolutely do oppose the renewal of that. So there's already a slightly different agenda there, and I think at the hustings we're having later, this is all going to come out and be discussed, and I hope it is.
There's a whole range of views and ideologies represented among the 4 candidates, perhaps apt for a time when the Labour Party is debating what it stands for and what it believes.
Joining us now to reflect on the leadership contest are 3 former Labour MPs who all lost their seats to the SNP in May. Tom Greatrex, who represented Rutherglen and Hamilton West, Ann McKechin, who represented Glasgow North, and Tom Harris, who was the member for Glasgow South. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us this evening. Tom Greatrex, what's your assessment of the field of candidates?
Well, we've got an interesting field. I think the first decision the Labour Party collectively has to make is whether we want to be a party that can aspire to be in government to deliver things, or we want to be a protest movement. And to me, that rules out one of the 4 candidates very clearly. And then there's a judgment about
Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, and then it's a judgment about, amongst the other 3, who is best placed to be able to make the right challenges in terms of policy, but also to present our case as effectively as possible in the next 5 years. It's a tough job. It's a job that's going to need whoever wins needs the defeated candidate to be very actively involved in supporting them to do that job. And personally, I have yet to make up my mind. I saw all of the candidates at hustings in Dublin at the GMB Congress a few weeks ago, and I'll see them again tomorrow, and that will help to make my judgment. And I think that's the case for lots of party members, actually. They're wanting to hear what each of the candidates have to say before they make their judgment.
Yeah, lots of people still waiting to decide. Anne, how strong is the field, do you think?
Well, I think it represents all different wings of the party. I think the Labour Party is a broad church. It has to appeal to the centre and to the left. And I think it will be a very difficult choice, as Tom said, but for me it is someone who can be a potential Prime Minister. I haven't made up my mind. I'll be listening very carefully tomorrow to the candidates. I suspect my choice will be between Yvette and Andy, but I'll be interested to hear about how they see Labour's vision for the United Kingdom over the next 5 to 10 years, and particularly their strategy for Scotland.
We can talk about Scotland in more detail in a moment, but Tom, you know, who's your favourite? Who have you?
I think the last time I was here in the studio, I did mention that I was supporting Liz Kendall, and I'm very strongly of that opinion that I hope she does win. I think when we're talking about the strength of the field, I think it is. There's no one obviously missing from this field. You know, there's no big hitter that we're thinking, well, I wish he or she had stood. I think what we have is, in those three candidates, I do exclude Jeremy Corbyn as well, but between Andy, Yvette and Liz, I think we have got three of the best people on the front bench. I think any of them would be a good leader, but as Tom rightly says, the question isn't who's going to be a good Labour leader. I mean, who cares about that? Who is going to be a Labour Prime Minister? That's the question.
Well, none of you are supporting Jeremy Corbyn, but he's picking up a lot of support in the constituencies, and Unite are backing him. What's that all about then?
Well, I was at the GMB conference, which was the first hustings, I think one of the first ones in this process, where before the nominations had closed. Jeremy Corbyn went down very well. People liked what he said, but talking to people afterwards, the GMB is a union which has at its conference many more people who are less sort of political but more representative of workplaces across the country. They said, yeah, I like what Jeremy Corbyn said, but he's not going to win this election. He's not going to be a potential Prime Minister. And then, you know, I think that's a judgment that lots of people will also make, is that he might appeal and tug to the heartstrings on certain issues, and but actually he's not going to be in a position to make us a government. And what we've seen in the last few days, in the last week, we've seen a report come out from the Competition and Markets Authority basically endorsing what Labour's policy on energy prices was. We've seen, you know, a budget where George Osborne has slowed down the cuts in the same way that we said he was, and tackled non-dom tax status.
Okay.
These things which we could win the arguments on, but we can't do it unless we're in government. We can't do other things as well, so we need to be in government.
Okay, well, let's move on to Andy Burnham. He's being seen as the front runner. Would you? Well, you don't agree with that because you want Liz Kendall, but do you think he's got a good chance?
I agree he's the front runner. If I would put money on it, I'd probably assume that Andy is going to win, if I'm honest. I hope he doesn't. I hope Liz wins, because I think the problem I think we have, well, first of all, with Andy, there should be warning bells ringing when you know that many Conservatives want Andy to win, and the reason they want him to win is because they know that all they have to do is say two words, mid-staffs. And already he's on the defensive. I think the way the last Labour government, the way he behaved as the Health Secretary in the last government, it was very damaging. It was a wrong judgment. And I think there's no way that Tories are going to let him get off the hook on that.
Would you think that's a problem, his mid-staff connection?
I think anyone who's been a politician at the top for a number of years is going to have a problem. Probably Yvette is going to have, well, you know, Ed Balls is your husband, and the Ed Balls references will come up about his economic record. And I mean, your opposition will always use any lever they can to get an advantage. I think it's actually whether you have a compelling and distinct vision which the public are going to actually follow. That's the key. Okay. How you handle these criticisms, and I think, to be fair, I think Andy's handled them reasonably well. I think he's also known for his Hillsborough campaigning, and actually a lot of people on the other side actually support him for that reason.
What lessons do you think the party needs to learn from the last election then, Tom Greatrex?
Well, I think, you know, when you look at our policy offer, and as I've just touched on, three policies which have now effectively been endorsed and implemented by the government that won the election. We couldn't convince people of those on the doorstep, and we couldn't win the election, not because necessarily the policy elements were wrong, but because the overall narrative was wrong, and people, you know, didn't see the Labour Party as being a party potentially of government. That's really what we've got to challenge. That's what we've got to tackle. That's why this leadership election is so crucial.
And they didn't see clearly then on the doorsteps, they didn't see Ed Miliband as the next Prime Minister, did they?
And they didn't see the Labour Party as the party of government, and a lot of that comes from the way in which the leader is portrayed, and that's why it's very important.
I mean, I liked Ed personally, But I think what we fell into the trap during the last Parliament was that we looked as if we were developing policy for ourselves to please the activists rather than making it a broader appeal. So a lot of what was in the manifesto, a lot of what we were campaigning for on the doorstep were things that actually I don't think had come from the public. They had come from the party, and I just don't think we connected at all with a lot of those policies.
I think our economic analysis was actually fundamentally right. I mean, the fact that George Osborne, as Tom's mentioned, is talking about living wage, talking about beginning to recognise that the buy-to-let market is producing problems in housing.
Why couldn't you connect with the voters
Well,
then?
I don't think it was sufficiently broad, because I think we concentrated on policies which focused primarily on people at the very bottom, in the lowest income quartile. I think rightly so. There's nothing wrong with these policies. They're good policies. They're policies I would expect a Labour government to promote. But we didn't actually provide really concrete policy options which appeal directly to a wider base of the voters.
Do you not think it was also because we just didn't have the permission of the voters to be heard? Because right from the very beginning, because we spent so long in a leadership election 5 years ago, we didn't actually defend ourselves against the lies from the Conservatives about how the crash was caused. And from that moment on, and Ed didn't help us in this either, from that moment on we didn't have economic credibility. So it didn't matter what we said, because we couldn't get across that one hurdle about having economic competence and credibility. Everything else we said, however valid it was, we just weren't being listened to.
We also, I don't think we're able to prove to a sufficient number of voters that the current government was incompetent enough for them to actually make a decision for a change. I think that's a key, because actually the government of the day will try to prove the opposition is a fear factor. I think Linton Crosby and the Conservatives were incredibly successful in achieving that. But we've also got to show that the current government was incompetent.
The four candidates are coming to Scotland tomorrow. How important is Scotland in this leadership contest?
Well, I mean, we've got a leadership contest happening in parallel, if you like, for the leadership and deputy leadership of the Scottish Party, and that is most important, I think, for the party in Scotland. But on a UK-wide basis, of course it's important, because whoever is elected as leader of the Labour Party will potentially be the Prime Minister in 5 years' time, depending on the election result, and that's something which we have to be able to sell on the doorstep. And that's what, again, let's come back to the same point, and that's why it's so important that we get this decision, make this choice correctly, because we'll end up with a government that is not going to do any good for people that we represented.
Tom, how important is Scotland for these candidates?
It's important, but I was asked my advice from a Labour activist in England who asked me over social media, who should we elect as the UK leader that most benefits Scotland? And my response was, forget about Scotland in that respect. Just elect whoever you want to elect. Scotland will either come back or it won't. I think, the last thing, none of the four candidates has the answers in Scotland. Not because they're not in touch or aren't clever people. The answers don't exist. The answers aren't out there at the moment. And I think the idea that we can elect somebody, one of these four people, and everything will be fine in Scotland, that's not going to happen. If Scotland comes back, and there's no guarantee that Scotland will ever come back to the Labour Party, if it comes back, it'll be over a very long period of time. And I don't think that we have to. I think the four candidates tomorrow night would be foolish, I think, to claim that they had all the answers, because I know that they don't.
That's a really interesting thing to say, Tom. And do you think the candidates should just forget about Scotland, concentrate on the rest of the UK?
I think we do actually have to define what our vision is of the United Kingdom. And I think that includes issues around decentralisation and devolution in other parts of the United Kingdom, but actually what the United Kingdom really stands for, because the issue of national identity is not just unique to Scotland, although obviously it's been a huge issue here and very intense. But national identity is arising as a political factor right across Europe at the present time, and centre and left of centre parties are struggling to actually define what they represent and their offer to the electorate. So this problem is not unique to the Labour Party here in the United Kingdom. It's one right across Europe, but I think it's one in which, as I think Tom rightly says, the leader is not going to make the instant answer here, but we need to have a good leader who people will actually be attracted to generally.
How important is the personality of the leader? I mean, we saw with Ed Miliband that people just didn't see him as a Prime Minister.
Yeah, the television age, of course personality is important. This idea that it's only policy that matters. I mean, it's the 21st century. the leader of the Labour Party, the leader of the opposition, is going to be on television all the time. They're going to be in chat shows. They're going to have to project what the personality is, and a lot of people will decide who to vote for. It's like during the 2000 election. Would you rather have, in America, would you rather have a glass of beer with George Bush or Al Gore? And it sounds ridiculous, but sometimes that's the kind of judgments that are made about who you vote for.
On a very superficial level, that's what it's all about, isn't it, Tom?
It is. I mean, people have to be able to see the person as being someone they could visualise being standing outside or inside, being inside Downing Street. That's a fundamental, and that's, again, to come back to the point, that's why this judgment is so crucial for the party, and why all the candidates need to really demonstrate what they stand for in the hustings tomorrow, for people to be able to make up their minds. Because although Andy Burnham may be the front runner, I also think there's a lot of people in the Labour Party who are looking to see what other candidates have to say before making their decision and their judgment. And personally speaking, I think it'd be quite a good idea if we had a female leader, not as the main criteria for happening to be female, but I think that's something which also is a factor in this.
And credibility to be Prime Minister is the most important thing. The problem I've got with the Labour Party at the moment is that whoever wins, they start off with a fairly major disadvantage, which is that they're members of the Labour Party. And the state we're in at the moment, that immediately takes away some credibility.
We will have to leave it there, but thank you all very much indeed for joining us.